Hey, Ann here, and I don't do unboxings very often, but I thought I would do this. I just got some new watercolors called Haze. They're granulating watercolors, and I somehow missed knowing about these. I try to keep track of all the fun new. There's a big box for this little box. Granulating colors by Schminke. I by no means have all of them, but I do have a few, and they're some of my favorites. So this is the Haze series. It's a super granulation trio that has, type is small, I can't read it. I'm gonna have to look at the tubes. They're tiny little tubes too. I wanted to give these a try. So I have Haze Pink, Haze Brown, and Haze Indigo. And I thought those would be some fun colors to try. And so I'm going to get a sketchbook and we'll test them out. So I've pulled out a ceramic palette and also a dagger brush, and I'm using a dagger brush for swatching purely because it's a brush I don't often reach for because I'm not as familiar with it. So I've been trying to use it for swatching things lately just so I get more accustomed to the feel of it, what it can do, and maybe I will make better use of it that way. And then I'm also pulling out this little Tomoe River paper sketchbook that I use for my color swatching. I have a record in it of like my fountain pen inks and my Tombos and, things like that in it. So I tried it on that paper. And then this is a Life Noble notebook, which I'm not sure what kind of paper this is. It's kind of a cream color and it's fairly smooth. But I do like how it takes watercolor, and I've done a bunch of like watercolor experiments, like watercolor mixed with different things in here, so it seemed like a good place to try out these watercolor paints. I'm just checking to see how it works with wet on wet. You saw me do some strokes with that dagger brush, make some nice fine lines. So I tried that out, and I'm just generally playing around with these paints, see how it acts, see how it mixes with each other, and then I'm also going to try mixing some colors a little bit and see how these colors work together. Adding in a little bit more of the Haze Pink. So far it is my favorite, I will say. I'm mixing it with a bit of the sepia, the Haze Brown, that's kind of a sepia color. Now I'm pulling out my Art Creations sketchbook, and it's a little bit wider paper but still kind of cream colored, and I am really letting these mix on the paper, see how they blend together, which they do blend very nicely with each other. They're not a real intense color. It's more about the granulation and the color separation that you get, especially with the Haze Pink. You get a lot of color separation. Now I'm pulling out my Hannah Mule watercolor sketchbook, and I have some illustrations here that I'd already done that my October patrons have received, and I am just adding a little touch-up with those with the Haze colors. These are not very strong colors, but as you can see, it does add to the shadowing and shading, and will add some texture to these illustrations. These little monsters were a lot of fun to do because it doesn't really matter what a monster looks like. There's not a right or wrong, and so it was fun to do these. A lot of freedom here, and it's fun to use these Haze watercolors to add shadows and shading onto them. So I feel like these Haze watercolors are perhaps really good as accessory colors or mixing colors or adding some shadows or highlights because they are not super intense and so are really good added in with something else. Now I just have this little 4x6 sheet of watercolor, actual cold pressed watercolor paper. It's not a super high quality one, but it is definitely got the watercolor, the cold pressed texture on it. So I'm trying this out. This is the roughest paper. I've kind of gone from the smoothest to the roughest here as I've tried these out, and you can really see some of that color separation and some of the a bit of the granulation happening on here, and how beautiful these colors really are, how nicely they blend with each other, and what a beautiful effect that you can get with those. So I'm not painting anything particular here. I'm just kind of playing with them on the paper and trying out different mark making. Again, using this brush that's somewhat new to me, as well as just seeing what the paint will do. I think these paints have great potential for beautiful textures. I'm thinking stones right now would be really lovely with this texturing and blend of colors. The particular colors, these three colors blended together, I think would make beautiful stonework, rocky cliff sides, stone buildings, some different applications like that. So that's really what I have in mind. So now that my swatches are dry in these books, I'm labeling, particularly in my color swatch book, where I keep a record of the different colors in various media that I have. I'm going back to these little swatches I made in the Life Noble notebook, and you know, I'm seeing, I guess I have monsters on my mind, so I'm seeing little creatures in these swatches. I didn't paint them with that in mind, but I'm kind of finding little creatures in this swatch as I go. So I'm just kind of taking a pen and going back and finding those shapes and enhancing them to bring out the creatures that I see in them. This one looked like a bit like a teddy bear if I turn it sideways, and so I'm adding in a little bit monstrous teddy bear features here. And then for this final one, I see this little fish in the little paint blob that I made. So I do think these would be a great paint to prepare a page with, like in a sketchbook, to have sometimes I like to lay a little bit of color down first before I get to using that sketchbook page, even though I don't know what, you know, might be created on that page. So here I'm just, you know, blending these in to make a full sheet of color on this page, just playing around, blending everything together on that, seeing how they mix and blend, which I think is quite lovely. These are very pretty colors, and together they're very lovely. So now I'm going to pull out this sketchbook-ish page and just try decorating the page a bit. So I'm keeping it very light and subtle. Like I said, I don't know what's going to be drawn on top of this. But this way it just kind of gives a little start to the page, a little hint of color to the page. So just something interesting on there to work with when I get to it. So now I'm going back and checking that little tiny art creations notebook, and just kind of, I've done a lot of little swatches in it, and just checking how the paint dried, which was beautiful. So now I'm taking another one of those little 4x6 watercolor note cards. I'm using a Kaweco Sport fountain pen out of my little travel kit. It does have water-soluble ink, so I know that the ink will bleed. Sometimes that's a good thing as I'm making sketch and add water to it, and it can be really fun to have that ink bleed out and do the wash for you. You really don't need any watercolor when you're using that. So it was probably a mistake to use this when I'm wanting to try out the watercolors, because it makes it harder to tell what's the ink itself and what's the watercolor. But nevertheless, I am continuing on with this, and the watercolors kept making me think of beautiful stones as I was swatching them, and so I decided to make a little stone scene here to actually paint. You see that blue, the ink that is in my fountain pen was a deep blue, so you see the illustration doing a lot of blue here with some of that new Haze watercolor blending in with it. It is really pretty how the two blend together, and that probably is good for me to know how that's going to behave together, but I did totally kind of lose what the true colors of the watercolor were in this. So I'm going to put on a little music as I finish. I do this one and another one as well that I use a Pentel brush pen to do the line work, and so you can kind of see the different ways. You can see how the watercolor blends with this fountain pen ink, and then also how it behaves with a waterproof ink. So here you can see that I'm putting the watercolor down first, painting my image entirely in watercolor before I do any inking on it. I think that is a way that I usually prefer, as in I prefer the outcome of doing it this way. I kind of default to doing my ink work first and then painting it in more like a coloring book, but I do really like the looks better when I work this direction. That first piece is dry now, so I'm going back with the pencil and kind of refining those lines that totally dissolved away. I do think this is really lovely, the how the watercolor and the ink blended together made kind of beautiful colors. And the trouble, I feel like I kind of messed it up by getting too much detail. I need to learn to leave things a little looser, and I would like it better but this was a beautiful image before I drew in too many details with pencil.